Hey friends, Chris Jones here. I want to talk for just a second about one of the stories in The Bones Stand Up, which is a collection of short stories from the Trinity Flynn universe. The first book in the universe, of course, is Trinity Flynn and the Five Points Gang. And this is not a sequel. The Bones Stand Up is a collection of short stories that take place in various different times, most of them before the events of Trinity Flynn and the Five Points Gang. Especially this story, which is the last one in the collection. It's actually more of a novella called And This Gives Life to Thee. It's the origin story of the relationship between Rasmus Flynn and Zlatica Nemchikova, who will eventually become Lata Flynn. Their first meeting does not go well. It takes place in Bern, Switzerland. Bern is a major city in Switzerland and was a very important town in terms of international negotiations. Now, around the time that we're talking about in this particular story, which is the early part of the 1990s, late part of the 1880s, sorry, not 1990s, 1890s. The end of 1880 and the early part of 1890 are the first attempts on a global scale to get some kind of international organization together, some sort of United Nations type thing. Now, if you know your history, you know that the United Nations did not come into being until after World War II, and that there was an attempt for about a decade during and after World War I by Woodrow Wilson, who was president of the United States at the time, to build what was called the League of Nations. This is one of the attempts that goes way, way, way back further than that. It's a Congress of Delegates. There was a Frenchman who decided that it might be a good idea, in order to prevent war and get nations to talk to each other, to get representatives from different legislatures, of which now there are an enormous number in the late 1800s, and bring those representatives together in a place that they might want to go, like, I don't know, Switzerland, and get them to talk to each other, to make proposals to each other, to take ideas back to their various legislatures that might help to advance the cause of people and keep the world out of war. Of course, it doesn't work. In 1914, we have the explosion of World War I, and then 25 years later, in 1939, the advent of World War II. However, there are some interesting things that are happening there. One of those things is an attempt by the Irish to get independence from Britain. Now, if you know your British history, you know that Ireland was under the thumb of the British for a long time. The conflict is both political and religious. Of course, England, after Henry VIII, decided that Protestantism was the way to go, and the Irish never gave up their Catholicism, or the vast majority of the Irish never did, which meant that there were religious conflicts all the time. Catholics were not able to serve in Parliament. Catholics were not able to own guns. In some places in Britain, Catholics were not permitted to own land. And so Catholics are constantly agitating for their own political freedom, to have an opportunity to become free. Rasmus gets involved in violent protests on that when he's a young man. And at this point in our tale, at the beginning of the story, he has been made a part of a delegation of Irishmen to go to this Congress in Bern and see if they can get an international agreement to ask the British Parliament to let Ireland have home rule, to have their own government on Irish soil. I won't tell you whether this succeeds or not, but it's a subject of some conflict and tension. And Lata herself ends up in Bern as a refugee from Slovakia, which is being crushed. The protests there are being crushed by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is in the process of going to pieces and will come completely apart during the conflict of World War I. When they meet each other, let's just say it doesn't go well. Rasmus is a kind of a doofy Irishman who doesn't speak any Slovakian, and Lata is a whip-smart but also highly bitter young woman who understands and speaks reasonably good German, but doesn't speak a whole lot of English. So we have a kind of a conflict here of language, but also of personality style, and it's going to be a little bit before they learn how to respect each other. Eventually, well, you'll see when you read the story. That story is called This Rest to Which I Go.